Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to talk about how compensation committees are adapting to an evolutionary ESG environment. And joining me is, as my guest, is Susan Chapman, who's a board member with J.M. Smucker's company. And interestingly enough, she's also a founding member of the advisory council for the Next Gen board members. So welcome, Susan.
Thank you, TK. It's wonderful to be here. I appreciate you having me.
So we're focusing on comp, and you, a couple of years ago, you served as the chair of the comp committee for Potbelly Corp on their board, and now you serve on the Smucker's comp committee. So you've had a chance to experience some interesting times that comp committees have been through in the last couple of years, not only with respect to compensation, but a changing society and certainly changing in ESG.
Yes.
So what sort of stands out to you as some of the bigger challenges that comp committees have had to sort of overcome in the last couple of years?
Well, I think it's a great question, first of all. And I think there's a couple of things that I have observed. One, the elephant in the room is COVID. And certainly comp committees have had to figure out how to ensure that executive teams have been incentivized to navigate through what have probably been the roughest waters that many companies have seen, whether companies have done really well and seen a boost to their earnings, or companies have really been challenged. And so being able to navigate through those waters, ensuring that teams are appropriately engaged and compensated and incentivized, I think are all things that comp committees have been having conversations about. Certainly through COVID, we've seen a much more enlightened focus on the S in the E, S and G. Certainly the E part of ESG has been there for a while. Many companies have figured out how to navigate through those waters, whether it's from a reporting perspective or beginning to tie compensation to their executive teams around making gains on the E side of the equation. They're probably more manageable because you've seen more legislative things driving that, more organizations, whether they're investors or, other organizations beginning to look at how to push companies to get with the program, if you will. And so I think that guide has probably been easier. You certainly see ISS and other like companies or like organizations having an eye towards it and giving companies guidance on how they'd like to see the E. But the S is more hard to deal with, right? S is this thing that people are beginning to grapple with, and there aren't a lot of answers because there aren't a lot of guides out there in terms of how to deal with it. So I think you have some companies that are leaning in hard and others that are waiting on the sidelines a little bit to figure out, well, what's the best way to navigate? Just as an example, something as basic as having diversity on your board, right? You say that, and then you say, okay, well, how do you measure diversity on your board? Female diversity has been fairly easy to measure, but when you start talking about ethnic diversity and racial diversity on your board, that gets harder because there is no requirement for identification of a board member to say, hey, I'm Black or I'm Latinx or whatever. And so how do you actually measure those things is going to be something that companies will have to work their way through. Now, look, some companies ask up front in terms of how people identify and have been willing to share those metrics publicly, but certainly it's something that I think is going to continue to evolve.
Yeah, there is absolutely no question that institutional investor pressure around all this is just really ramping up. And it's not only in the US, but it's that way globally.
Absolutely.
So, and as you said, there's a special challenge for comp committees because the metrics, other than some environmental metrics, but as you said, the metrics in the social are still not complete or committed to, in the sense of this is the structure that you should use to evaluate that. So it puts the comp committee in this position that investors want to see something out of it. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet you have to, as a comp committee, have to get creative in the sense of how you're going to do that. Now, one way to get creative, again, is the comp committee all of a sudden has to use a fair amount of discretion.
You do. Although you do have to use some discretion, but I would also say that you focus on what you can measure. And so if a leadership team, for example, is given the direction to have diversity on their team, you can measure that. You can absolutely measure it. There are companies out there that set goals. So just like you have goals for revenue growth, and just like you have goals for margin improvement, you have goals for diversity for your business. And coming out of last summer, in particular, in the wake of the events around George Floyd's murder, you saw many companies beginning to step out and be very vocal about the stake in the ground that they're going to put around diversity and around these measures. The Business Roundtable was very vocal about encouraging their members and taking a stand there. And so I do think there is discretion, yes, but there is also clear opportunities to measure. And at the end of the day, the numbers don't lie.
Think about the challenge that you have of determining how much you pay, how much.
That's right.
When does it kick in? How does it go? That's it. That's a tremendous challenge, I think, for comp committees to say, okay, now that I have a measurable, what percentage, how am I going to, how do we do that? So it puts compensation committees in a huge challenging role to say, okay, this is what we're comfortable with.
It does. And it especially does because you want a metric that's meaningful, right? And we've all seen situations just in our own walks of life where you have scorecards and you end up with these metrics at the bottom that have like 2%, 3%, 4%. I mean, those don't really move the needle. And so the question is, how do companies get to a place where they can have a meaningful measure in place that really moves the needle in the direction that they'd like it to go? To me, that means that they have to be aware and that things are going to change, right? So, what you put in place today, just given the changing landscape of the environment, will likely change. So staying close to what's happening in the marketplace, understanding what your peers are doing, leaning on your compensation consultants to help you navigate to understand what's happening in your sector, all things I think compensation committees have to do to be prepared to navigate their way through this. And again, it's no different to me than the E. If you think back 10 years ago on the E, we were having the same conversations. What should we do? How much could we put in place that's actually meaningful? Where do you go with this? As both the technology and the measurement and the pieces associated with putting those building blocks in place have gotten more refined, it's gotten easier to make those decisions. And I don't think that the S will be much different. It just will take some time.
Well, Susan, it wasn't too many years ago that the ISS tried to eliminate all discretion from comp committees. And can you possibly imagine today, with what we're trying to accomplish on a compensation committee, not having any discretion to set it up for your own organization?
It'd be very, very difficult.
Yeah. Thankfully, that did not catch steam and do, because today I just can't imagine how that is. But let me ask you one other question. We have just a little bit of time left. So how challenging has it been from a compensation committee's perspective to have to do everything virtually versus, having at least some opportunity on face-to-face?
Yeah, I think it's really not the comp committee issue. It's more about the board engagement. in terms of being separate. I, for one, have joined a board completely virtually. I haven't met any of the members in person yet. I'm looking forward to that. So that certainly is harder because, as you know, boards operate extremely well when people have a chance to build stronger relationships, and that you just can't. There's nothing short of being in person to be able to do that. But with that being said, we're in a once in a 100-year event. I think we're all just grateful that we could still come together and really figure out how to pivot to keep the business of the company going forward and being supportive and carrying on our fiduciary responsibilities. And so I don't think anybody's complaining about it. Matter of fact, I think that what you'll see is more people will have a combination of in-person and virtual meetings going forward, and that just will be the standard.
Yeah, I highly agree with you. And but again, my heart reaches out to comp committees in this particular time frame because I think there are a number of challenges I think that are presented. And everybody used to laugh at the audit committee. Nobody wanted to be on it, and there was a lot to it. Well, guess who's joined? Guess what committee has joined the audit committee as far as workload?
That's true.
So.
That's true. Although I will still say audit has way more workload than comp, but having served on both and certainly, spent time doing both. But I do agree with you. But that's what makes this exciting. And look, nobody signs up for a board just because. You sign up because you want to add value to the organization and you want to drive better outcomes for the company. And so this is just a new frontier and a new opportunity for us to do that for the companies that we serve.
Well, Susan, I wanted to thank you for taking the time. Obviously, this is a hurdle that all comp committees are going to have to deal with in this, past year, and then certainly in the coming year. But I appreciate your wisdom and passing that along to our audience, and I'll look forward to having you back again someday.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And that will conclude this episode of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.